My name's George Stanley-Jones, and I'm your aforementioned punching bag when it comes to funding this afternoon. Just to say first, thank you to Central St. Martin's for inviting me along, and thank you to all of you for offering me this brief respite from a rather large, angry elephant Brexit shape in the room at the moment. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and I know we haven't got a huge amount of time, so I'll try and be brief, is kind of where government is when it comes to VR and kind of its view on VR as a sector, an emerging sector, and a kind of evolution of the sectors as we understand them, and to kind of draw some conclusions about what I think the challenges are for archiving are in that. And some really interesting stuff in the last sections, which I'll try and respond to as I go through this. Anyway, but who am I really briefly first? So I run a program in DCMS, and for anyone that doesn't know what DCMS is, it's the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Yes, there are 2 Ds in there. That happened recently. We haven't updated the acronym, and I doubt we will. But what Culture is Digital is a program, the first of its type in kind of UK government, which is kind of looking at the potential of bringing our kind of tech and culture sectors together to look at an increase in digital skills, an increase in partnership generation, and kind of allowing access to new technologies for the culture sector. And there's a quote at the start of there from our ex-Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, before he bounced off to the Department of Health, which is the UK's future will be built at the nexus of our artistic and cultural creativity and our technical brilliance. That's kind of where kind of Culture is Digital comes from. And you'll note that I've also used the headset forest image there that the BFI did earlier, because marshmallow laser fees kind of feature quite heavily in our report, and they've been quite monumental in some of the funding programs that came after Culture is Digital. So an interesting thing from what people were saying about kind of VR as a sector before, I think when it comes to kind of government interventions in there, like we've kind of looked at it as a new emergent sector and we've done that typical thing that government does, which is go, jobs and money and growth. And that's kind of where a lot of the investment has been in. And, you know, we kind of worked on this report recently of Immerse UK that kind of looked at the VR sector in the UK specifically, which found there are over 1,000 immersive specialist companies in the UK employing around 4,500 people. And interesting enough, 80% of those operate in digital and creative, so you can expect a large amount of that to be content creation. And just to kind of look at the kind of explosion and the pace in that recently, our kind of research funding devoted to immersive is 9 times higher in 2016-17 than it was in 2009 to 10. So it's huge and happening fast. And actually, when I was writing that out, I thought I'd just look up the next slide afterwards, which is a kind of a list from Wikipedia of all the releases of VR headsets specifically since Samsung VR in 2015. And what that is 30 headsets, although some of them are kind of iterations of previous ones in 4 years, which is roughly 7.5 a year, or just, you know, 1 every 2 months. So it's an extreme rate of change and pace, which is obviously a challenge for not only the kind of preservation of the content inherent to those, but also the questions of time-based media, because there's we're still in that kind of R&D phase, really. So in terms of how we're supporting VR, you've heard from some people today. Obviously, we've had funding relationships with the BFI, who are one of our arm's length bodies. Digital Catapult receive funding from DCMS. Immerse UK, if you haven't heard of them, they're really worth signing up for. They're a networking group for immersive specialists in the UK, and they bring together everything from kind of single creators to people like Rolls-Royce and the BBC that have got large kind of immersive investment programs. Creative XR, which is run by Digital Catapult and the Arts Council to invest in kind of arts prototype funding, and our own program, Culture is Digital, and I've obviously used a really terrible image there because the resolution's crap. But we have some partnerships with the National Gallery and the Royal Opera House, who are opening innovation labs, particularly aimed at a kind of challenge in the VR space, which is, especially when it comes to kind of small creators and lone artists, actually getting access to the technology in the first place in order to be able to experiment it. They're opening up these labs that we're working on at the moment to actually kind of give creators that access, which I think is really important. And the biggest thing we've invested in recently is what's called the Audience of the Future Challenge, which you might have heard of or might have not, which was a kind of £33 million R&D investment in content when it comes to immersive. Which was a really kind of interesting conceptual program that I worked on with the HRC and Innovate UK, which kind of tried to stake a claim that the UK's specialist advantage when it came to immersive was not in the kind of technological development, but in the creation of the content, and that as such we should be investing in those content creators and, as it says, the audience of the future, how we can actually invest in that shift of several mediums like video games, film, art, music, to kind of help embrace these new mediums and actually be part of that development. And as part of that, we've announced several kind of really big funding programs recently that are going to act as demonstrators of that technology. One of them is in the world of esports, bringing together ESL, University of York, and several VR companies to kind of think about VR headsets and the appreciation of esports and what kind of content can be added on the top of the experience of watching esports using VR. The next is a consortium led by the Royal Shakespeare Company to look at immersive performance experiences, which is a really fascinating one. You can see that huge cast list there, bringing everyone together from Epic Games to Magic Leap to Nesta, and the space there at the bottom. And no, look, Marshmallow Laser Feast again, which is nice. And then finally, I'll say it's my favorite just because of the title alone, Dinosaurs and Robots Consortium, which bring together Factory 42, Natural History Museum, Science Museum, and a whole other cast list to look at, especially AR in the experience of museums. And I'll just put this up here now because, we were talking about funding. We've got some funding open at the moment, which is wonderful. So this is an investment accelerator program which closes on the 3rd of April, and I'll just leave that up if people want to take a picture of that for any content creators they know. So this is an interesting new program that we're trialing, which usually in R&D programs, you have to have match funding to apply for it. In this program, there's a kind of pool of investors who will make up that match funding aspect to it. So it's particularly aimed at creators that don't have the capital to participate themselves. So it's a really interesting program. I hope it's something that we get to do more of because it really kind of tackles that access to finance barrier that's quite typical in this space. No, I've gone back one. There we are. So what does this mean for archive? I mean, one of the interesting things about that, and I've said it's typical of government to kind of think about the growth aspects, all of those funding programs don't have archiving built into them because I think we've looked at the sector and gone, we want this to be big. And I think a certain amount of that comes from the threat of international competition, really. You look at America, you look at China, you look at Korea, you look at Canada, and you say, we've got to grow this market as fast as we can. So what do? We kind of invest in the content and we invest in the technology. But what that means is there's an explosion of all this stuff. One of the things we're going to face, we spoke about loss before. I think that's going to be kind of inevitable because the rate of creation, the rate of change is too kind of large to really kind of consider that. But it's something that we need to kind of be paying more attention to. I'm going to kind of draw several conclusions to games archiving in the UK as well, because I think if you look at the way the sector's evolving, it's very similar to the way the games did, especially in the terms of like having big clunky machinery that's very expensive at the start, usually kind of involved in arcades, and that's how you access it until it evolves to the point of, having a home console and that standardization of a few competitive consoles. It's interesting to see if we have that same kind of route in VR. I expect that we might. So there's a challenge there with all of these kind of different hardware options and data sets and formats, and something that Stephen at the BFI was talking earlier that I kind of missed the word on, but system something, whatever, someone can tell me afterwards. But whether that actually comes down to a format where we can think about more standardized archiving is an open question. And there's an additional question of kind of what to archive there. Where if you look at games, there's never been any particular infrastructural support for the archiving of games in this country, although several kind of players around have done that. Interestingly, the British Library has done kind of archiving of the culture around games where it comes to kind of fan sites and things like that. And there's a huge amount kind of happening there on VR at the moment. I picked this up here because I saw it pop up on YouTube the other day. Korean Bird talks about his brother's death in VR chat. Just the content around VR as a cultural phenomenon is huge and happening already. And you see there's 2.8 million views of that. It's actually quite, it's culturally significant. And that aspect of it is worth thinking about in that question of preservation. And also just whether the kind of current categories work. I mean, someone compared VR archiving to me the other day as like trying to think about merging games archiving with performance archiving. This is new stuff entirely, and whether, and I think, hearing from the BFI and Tate and others, it's really interesting to think about, it's not just like a new media or a new sector, it's an evolution of different medias and different sectors. Which brings me on to my question someone else asked me the other day, which is who should do it? Represents an evolution and convergence of different media forms, and expertise obviously does lie across different individuals and institutions. I think there is sometimes a tendency to nominate a leader and say that we should fund them and make them do it and they will set a standard, but that's a kind of challenge in itself. And there's an open question about whether there's a disconnect between industry, cultural institutions, and the user or the player base when it comes to the importance of archiving. If you look at games and the kind of grey market of emulation, there's a definite kind of view about what they value in there, which might be different to kind of what cultural institutions might. And I think a really interesting thing in the games world development recently was the changes to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in America, where they basically made space for players to revive MMOs and MMORPGs to kind of play those that have been basically mothballed by the developers because they were too expensive to run. And then there's the open question that by nominating a single provider, do we stifle innovation in this phase? I mean, we've used the phrase, this is the R&D phase at the moment. I think it's good that there are these dispersed attempts to archive and preserve VR, because having those multiple attempts and being able to compare and contrast those is what can help lead to something sustainable and worthwhile. So then lastly, how can we join the dots? So one thing that's running under my program, and it's being headed by the National Archives, is a task force that's working with a number of different people, and I think the BFI and the Tate sit on it, to think about that kind of strategic approach and to bring together different resources. I think it was really encouraging to hear from those guys before that these conversations are happening now, because I think, and definitely in an event like this, it's really important that we have the space to kind of compare and contrast approaches. And for me, being here from government, it's really important to hear these messages from different people as they're evolving these approaches. And lastly, there's a really good opportunity coming up for UK research and innovation, who are kind of plotting out their infrastructure roadmap at the moment. And in their preliminary findings, they've identified that one of the real key infrastructures that are available to kind of research in this country is cultural collections. And so actually kind of making that case to UK research and innovation to kind of invest in that area and see it for the importance it is something really strong. And for the technologies that come along it, like AI, that might allow us to kind of map out those different collections and read across them. So thank you very much for hearing me ramble. I'm just going to leave this up for a moment if anyone's interested in any of these things. The Audience of the Future program is that funding program that I mentioned earlier, and there are several reports that I referenced as well. Lastly, contacts. If you'd like to get in touch with me because you feel like you need to lobby me after this, by all means, take a picture of my email address. Valerie Johnson, who runs our task force on digitization as well, is more than happy for you to get in touch. The task force itself is reporting in June with its preliminary findings, but we're kind of talking to them about it going further, and there could be a role for a question around VR and new media as part of that. So if you'd like to get in touch with her, please do so. Thank you very much.